You're going to hear a lot about collaboration. In many ways, the topic of conversation with collaboration nowadays is equivalent to co-teaching because that's what all the buzz is about. However, I want to take a moment to discuss another collaborative practice that is consultation. We talked about it just for a moment in Unit 1 where communication was being discussed. However, let's talk about consultation as a service delivery option for students that have plans. One of the things that I did when I wanted to talk to you about consultative practices is to look at the research. While there isn't a whole lot of recent research on consultative practices, I did, however, find a really interesting article by Gutkin in 1996 that really discussed the core essential fundamentals for consultative practices as service delivery options. And he has some interesting things to say, and I'm not sure that in almost 20 years later that there are some issues with the things that he brought about, but let's talk about that. Where consultative relationships are concerned, that he felt that there were three key pieces to that. One was that they be collaborative. Now, I feel that this was really insightful in that in being collaborative with the person that you're consulting with, not only are you going to be able to look for avenues to build trust within relationships and potential future co-teaching opportunities, but you also look to that expertise as far as both of you being experts. And Gukin actually did write a small piece about that, and I want to read it to you. It says, rather than viewing consultants as experts with all the answers, consultants and consultees are both viewed as professionals with relevant experience to contribute to the consultation process. I really like that he felt that way because I really feel that that's the essence of special education and general education collaboration. Both are experts. They have sometimes different things to offer, but both should be looked at as necessary ingredients. So, the traditional thoughts of consultation are that one's the expert and one's going to gain from that expertise. I'm not sure that that should be true in consultative relationships with general ed and special ed anymore, but the nature of them is that you are providing support to the student through that general ed teacher. The second point that he made was that it was voluntary. I don't really feel that in today's standards that relationship is necessarily voluntary, because with the legal aspects coming into play and that need to provide service if it is written into the IEP, and we'll talk about that in a minute, that it really can be considered voluntary. I think as a special education teacher, and maybe as a change agent as a general education teacher, we need to make those relationships feel as though they are voluntary and not forced and not mandated. Sometimes we come to the point where that has to be put into place because it's not happening, and that's what the IEP mandates. But I think that it should have the feel of being voluntary and collegial. Um, and to what extent that consultation is happening may be somewhat voluntary, but nonetheless. And then the third piece is confidential. All student information needs to be kept confidential. However, if you are consulting with anybody that has to do with the provision of services to that student, it is not a circumstance where you really need to worry about confidentiality. We are mandatory reporters if we hear of certain things that are neglect and abuse types of things. And you should not go and talk to another teacher who's not related to that student's needs and student services and say, oh, Jimmy did this and he had a really unexpected outcome and he didn't do as well as we thought. Well, Mrs. Johnson, who doesn't have Jimmy in her class, that's none of her business. Of course, you know this already. But I'm just making the point, if you're consulting with someone who's directly involved with that student's services, then within reason, meaning if a parent confides in you about something that's not abuse and neglect related, but it's not essential to the conversation you're having with other people, then you don't necessarily have to disclose it, but be cautious of those things. Now, as a service delivery, for those of you that are not familiar with IEPs, there is a page of the IEP that lines out the different types of services and how much time and who's going to provide it. Consultation, or sometimes listed as indirect services, is a listing on the IEP and can be used and should be used for students that only need a certain level of support and service. Now, what I'm talking about is under special education law, and this started out way back with 94-142 public law, and managed to maintain within all the reauthorizations of IDEA, even the newest one. And it originated from parents who didn't want their special education children, and I shouldn't say it that way. I'm always taught put the child first. Children with special education, and that's something I'll teach you too. Always put the child first language. That they didn't want their children segregated from the rest of the general ed population. So the law incorporates a terminology that is called least restrictive environment. If you're not familiar with that term, that is something that you can find in special ed law as well as IEPs, and other processes. Least restrictive environment, or LRE, is the determination of in one environment is um, uh, the least restrictive, or starting with general education, is the least um, away from general education that a child can maintain growth and have their needs provided for. So we always start out with a student, um, with the thoughts of a student maintaining in the general education and providing supports, but sometimes that's not enough. So when we have their least restrictive environment, if that is general education and they need minimal supports, one of the service delivery options may be the indirect or consultative practices, to where the teacher is working with the general education teacher to make sure that their needs are provided for and help them provide for those needs. Now, the purposes, according to Gutkin, were very different. They were more of problem solving and prevention. Now, I've expanded the purposes for today's um, kind of needs, and I've listed several things here. Allowing students to access the curriculum is one of the purposes of consultation. That might include accommodations for students. Allowing students to have progress toward their goals, their IEP goals likely, if not other plans. That could include problem solving and intervention, modifications, and also prevention. I do think it's an important aspect to look to see what we could do to help general education teachers plan for things that we know are going to be difficult for those students, or that are going to need to be modified or accommodated for. Not placing a student in a situation in which we know that they are going to be unsuccessful. So looking at the prevention of, of problems is a huge factor in consulting. And then lastly, teacher support. Again, we still have this collegial, everyone's an expert philosophy, but we all know that general education teachers can have many, many students in their classrooms, and sometimes really honing in on the individual needs of one could be where a special education teacher's expertise is really needed. Maybe even some resources that the teacher doesn't have at hand, or things that you know work for that student, and maybe the development of some particular strategies that teacher hasn't had development on yet that would work with the student is necessary. Now, within those purposes, that problem solving measure is a place where a good process can come in handy. Because when you sit down to work out a circumstance with a general education teacher and a special education teacher together, you need to kind of follow some guidelines to make sure that it's consistent and meeting the needs. The first thing you need to do is to define the problem. Define the problem and to define the behavior. You need to, get on equal terms of what's going on and what's being seen. The second thing is to analyze it. Okay, this is what's going on and this is what's being seen, but why? What are the common circumstances that this is happening in? Is it only happening in this teacher's class? Is it happening in other classes? Is it only happening during certain types of lessons or certain days of the week? What is going on? What are the commonalities when these things are happening or when this problem is occurring? Then brainstorming. What are the possible strategies that could be used to assist the student with this problem? What are the interventions that could possibly be used? Then to select one. This needs to be something that you do together. Both of you have to have buy-in to the strategy. You can tell a teacher to do a strategy, walk away, and when that door is closed behind them in the classroom, they're just still going to do whatever they think is the best method. So you need to be on board together as to what is the best option. Selection also entails what is going to be the most effective strategy, what is research based, and what fits the needs of the child the most. This next item is of the utmost importance, and I don't care what type of student or what type of plan, in any problem solving circumstance, specify responsibilities. You need to know who's going to be in charge of doing what, whose responsibility is what. You don't want a circumstance where one or the other of you is coming back saying, oh, I thought you were going to do that, or I thought the paraprofessional or the instructional support person was going to help with that, or, and so on. It can completely destroy your relationship and not be effective. And then the last thing is to evaluate. Evaluate is multi-component here. You need to have something to evaluate. So you need to collect data. Once you've defined and analyzed the behavior, then you can decide how you're going to collect data on it. Make sure that the two of you are in alignment with how that data is going to be collected and what you're collecting, whose responsibility it is. And then once you have the data, then you can look at it and evaluate it and determine whether or not that method is effective, or whether some modifications need to be made, or whether some changes need to be made to that. Now, one of the interesting things that Goodkin mentioned in his need for future research back in 1996 was to discuss more on group consultation. That is something that we have come to do quite a bit in education nowadays. In almost every building I work in or walk into, there's some sort of problem-solving teams. Sometimes that is the RTI team. There are grade content teams, or excuse me, there are grade level teams or possibly content area teams that are working together. People that are additional service providers are being pulled in. The support personnel that you have, paraprofessionals and whatnot, are being pulled in to collaborate with. Now, what I will tell you is that either if you're a general education teacher or a special education teacher, you need to promote the practice of being collaborative in these teams. The one safeguard that you need to know about is that because there can be so many teams within a particular building and so very few special education personnel, it's not always physically possible for that special education specialist to be able to attend all those meetings. But as best as you can to work out a plan for that person having some involvement would be to the benefit of all students. Now, this last little piece that I will just tag on to the end is talking about parent involvement. We're not really going to dive into it where consultation is concerned. We will talk more specifically in Units 4 and 5 about parent participation and evaluation. However, just a little footnote, it's always important to consider how parents can be part of a two-way conversation at any level. Consultation, the IEP, writing of the IEP, ongoing assessment, any of that. By two-way, what I mean is that it's not just a phone call to the parent keeping them informed. That's not what I mean by two-way. Two-way is where they're giving input as well as a team, IEP team expert. I'll explain what I mean by that in later units. But they're able to give information, solicit questions, solicit information, and also be on that information gaining side as well. It's a real true collaborative practice. We'll talk more about that in future units. Thanks.